I'm a 29-year-old freelance graphic designer, and after a long week of managing deadlines and picky clients, I love unwinding with a bit of treasure hunting. Thrift stores, flea markets, and yard sales, there's something magical about finding an item with a story. One Saturday morning in mid-July, I was driving through the quiet streets of Millfield, a small suburb just outside of Denver, when I spotted a handmade sign for an estate sale. Spur-of-the-moment detours like these rarely yield anything spectacular, but they're always worth a look. The house was a charming old Victorian with an overgrown garden and a driveway full of tables cluttered with random items. There were vintage books, dishware, faded photographs, and an assortment of tools that caught my eye. Among the tools was an old, green metal toolbox, speckled with rust. It instantly reminded me of the one my dad kept in the garage when I was a kid, tools that always smelled faintly of oil and cedar. Curiosity got the best of me, and I opened it to find a small collection of worn wrenches, screwdrivers, and a wooden-handled hammer. Nothing extraordinary, but it felt like a piece of history. "How much for this?" I asked the older woman running the sale. She looked to be in her late 60s, her silver hair tucked under a floppy sun hat. "Oh, that old thing?" She smiled. $5 will do." I handed her the cash and thanked her, chatting briefly about how tools like these just aren't made the same anymore. With the toolbox tucked under my arm, I headed home, feeling like I'd scored a piece of nostalgia. For the first week, the toolbox sat in the corner of my apartment, untouched. I'd almost forgotten about it until one evening, while eating dinner, the doorbell rang. It was a little after 7 p.m., and I wasn't expecting anyone. Wiping my hands on a dish towel, I opened the door cautiously. Standing there was a man I didn't recognize, probably in his early 40s, with scruffy brown hair and a wiry build. His eyes darted around nervously. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping the door partially closed. "Yeah," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly. "You bought a toolbox at a sale last weekend, right?" I blinked, caught off guard. Yeah. "Why?" "That's mine," he said, leaning slightly closer. "It got sold by mistake. I need it back." Something about his tone made me uneasy. I hesitated, then replied, "I'm sorry, but I bought it fair and square. Maybe you should talk to the woman who sold it." He stared at me for a moment, his expression darkening, then nodded curtly. "Fine. But I'll be back." 2 days later, he returned. It was late afternoon, and I was watching TV when the doorbell rang again. This time, I peeked through the peephole before answering. There he was, looking more agitated than before. "Hey," he shouted, pounding on the door. "I know you're in there. Just give me the toolbox." I didn't answer. His tone was sharper now, almost menacing. After pacing on my porch for a few minutes, muttering under his breath, he finally left. But his visits didn't stop. Over the next week, he showed up at random times, early mornings, late at night, pounding on the door and yelling about the toolbox. One night, around 10 p.m., I heard the doorknob rattle. My stomach dropped when I realized I hadn't locked it. I bolted to the door, locking it just in time, and called a friend. "Call the cops," my friend insisted. "This guy sounds dangerous." I was hesitant. He hadn't done anything illegal, yet. But when he returned a few nights later, trying to shove the door open, I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. "I'm calling the police," I shouted, grabbing my phone with trembling hands. Through the door, I heard him mutter something before retreating. When the police arrived, I explained everything to the officer who came to my door. "Do you know this man?" the officer asked. "No," I said. "But he keeps claiming the toolbox I bought is his." The officer filed a report and assured me they'd keep an eye out. "If he comes back, call us immediately," he added. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I went to the garage, opened the toolbox, and carefully sifted through the tools. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, just the same old wrenches and screwdrivers. But then I noticed a faint seam at the bottom. A false panel. Using a screwdriver, I pried it open and froze. Beneath the panel were several small plastic bags filled with white powder. My stomach churned as the realization hit me: drugs. The next morning, I drove straight to the police station and handed over the toolbox. The officer I spoke to wasn't surprised. "You did the right thing," he said. "But I'd suggest being extra cautious. If this guy knows you've taken his stash, he might not give up so easily." I spent the following days on edge, half expecting the man to return. Thankfully, he didn't. But the whole experience left me shaken, a stark reminder that even innocent finds can have dark stories hidden within. Turning over the toolbox and its contents to the police felt like the right decision, but the officer's parting words echoed ominously in my mind: "Be cautious." As I pulled into my driveway that evening, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The porch light, which I always left on, was off, leaving the front of my house in an unsettling darkness. My pulse quickened as I stepped out of the car, phone in hand, scanning the area. Then I saw it. The front door was wide open, the lock shattered and dangling from the frame. A jolt of adrenaline surged through me, and I froze in place, staring at the gaping doorway. For a moment, I considered calling the police again, but the urge to know what was happening inside my own home pushed me forward. Keeping the 911 operator on the line, I cautiously stepped inside. The scene inside was chaos. My living room looked like it had been ransacked by a tornado. Cushions were thrown from the couch, shelves emptied, and papers scattered everywhere. My heart pounded as I moved deeper into the house. The kitchen was no better. Every cabinet door was flung open, dishes lay shattered on the floor, and even the contents of the fridge had been dumped onto the counter. As I turned down the hallway toward the bedrooms, I heard hurried footsteps. My breath hitched as I pressed myself against the wall, straining to listen. A moment later, the back door slammed shut. Peeking around the corner, I caught a fleeting glimpse of two men sprinting through my backyard, disappearing into the shadows beyond the fence. I wanted to chase after them, to yell, to do something, but fear rooted me in place. Instead, I waited, ensuring they were truly gone before venturing further into the house. My bedroom was in shambles. The mattress was flipped, closet doors hung open, and every drawer had been dumped out. It didn't take long to piece together what they'd been after: the toolbox. The realization sent a chill down my spine. The police had it now, safely tucked away in an evidence locker, but those men didn't know that. They'd been watching me, waiting for me to leave, before breaking in to retrieve their stash. These weren't petty thieves. They were desperate, and their willingness to tear apart my home proved it. The police arrived within minutes of my call. I described the two men as best I could, though I hadn't seen their faces clearly in the dark. The officers surveyed the damage, took my statement, and reassured me that they'd increased patrols in the area. "Do you think they'll come back?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay calm. "It's possible," one officer admitted. "But now that they know the toolbox isn't here, they might move on. Either way, we'll keep an eye out. In the meantime, install new locks and consider adding cameras." Over the next few days, I took every precaution. I replaced the locks, installed a security system, and stayed with a friend while I processed the violation of my safe space. Despite the physical measures, the sense of unease lingered. I found myself looking over my shoulder every time I came home, scanning for unfamiliar cars or faces. The police never provided an update, and I didn't know if they'd caught the man from the yard sale or his accomplices. Thankfully, they never returned, but the paranoia stayed with me. What began as a nostalgic yard sale purchase had turned into one of the most harrowing experiences of my life. I'd hoped time would help me move past it, but then something else happened, a discovery that made me question everything. A few months later, I stumbled across a box of old VHS tapes at another yard sale just a few streets away. Nostalgia tugged at me again, and I bought the box for a few bucks, excited to dive into a weekend of retro movie marathons. Most of the tapes were classics like E.T. and Back to the Future, but one stood out, a plain black tape with no label. Curious, I saved it for last, imagining it might be a bootleg concert or a long-forgotten home movie. That night, after sorting through the other tapes, I popped the unmarked one into my VCR. Static filled the screen for a moment before the footage began. It was grainy, like an old camcorder recording from the 80s or 90s. The image stabilized, revealing a family, a man, woman, and 2 kids, sitting in a cozy living room. They laughed, talked, and passed around a bowl of popcorn. At first, I thought it was just a random home video, but something about the scene tugged at my memory. The furniture arrangement, the wallpaper, the fireplace. It all felt eerily familiar. I leaned closer to the screen, and then it hit me, the living room on the tape wasn't just familiar, it was mine. My house. My living room. My pulse quickened as I studied the screen. The couch was positioned against the same wall. The fireplace had the same chipped mantel. Even the small alcove where I kept my bookshelf was unmistakable. But the video looked decades old, long before I'd moved in. I rewound the tape and watched again, trying to make sense of it. The family seemed ordinary enough, but as the footage continued, the mood shifted. The children stopped laughing, their expressions growing tense. The father stood abruptly, glancing toward the window. The mother whispered something I couldn't make out, her face etched with fear. Then, without warning, the tape cut to static. My chest tightened as I ejected the tape and stared at it. Who were these people? And why was their life recorded in my house? I spent the rest of the night searching for answers. Online property records revealed that the house had belonged to a family in the late 80s, but there were no records of anything unusual happening there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something connected this tape to the chaos I'd endured months earlier. I kept the tape, locked away in a drawer, but I haven't watched it since. Whatever secrets my house holds, I'm not sure I'm ready to uncover them. Some things, I've learned, are better left in the past. Decades ago, long before I'd moved in, I paused the tape and stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. My house had been built in the late 80s, and I purchased it 5 years ago from an older couple who had lived there for decades. The people in the video didn't match them, they were younger, likely in their 30s, with kids no older than 9. When I toured the house before buying it, I didn't see any photos or signs of children ever living there. I told myself it had to be a coincidence, perhaps footage of a previous family that lived here before the older couple. Yet something about the family's demeanor in the video gnawed at me, the growing tension, the glances toward the hallway, the palpable fear. Determined to understand what was going on, I hit play again. The family's laughter faded into unease as the video progressed. The children huddled close to their mother, nervously glancing toward the edge of the frame. The father stood abruptly, whispering something to the mother, who nodded, pulling the children even closer. My heart pounded as the camera panned slightly, revealing shadows flickering on the far wall. They moved unnaturally, like they didn't belong to the people in the room. Then one of the kids pointed toward the hallway. The mother shook her head, clutching him tighter as if to shield him from something unseen. The static on the tape grew heavier, but faint whispers began to emerge beneath the distortion. I leaned closer to the screen, straining to make sense of them. Suddenly, the camera jolted, the picture cutting to static. When the image returned, the angle had shifted. The view was now of the floor, showing only the family's feet as muffled cries and whispers filled the audio. A heavy thud broke through the background noise. My stomach dropped. The thud sounded like footsteps, deliberate and heavy, but the source remained off-screen. The family's feet shuffled as if retreating. The screen went black, leaving me staring at my reflection in the dark glass of the TV. I ejected the tape and held it in my trembling hands. My logical mind fought to dismiss the footage as a staged performance or a cruel prank. Yet, it felt too authentic, the fear in their faces, the whispers, the heavy thuds. I placed the tape on the coffee table, determined to revisit it later in the light of day. The next morning, I watched the tape again, this time paying closer attention to details. That's when I noticed the small calendar hanging on the wall in the background. The year printed on it was from 3 decades ago, well before I moved into the house. My unease deepened as I continued watching. Just before the screen cut to black, I noticed something I hadn't seen before, a shadow. It crossed the frame briefly, tall and angular, unlike anything human. It wasn't a regular shadow, it was as if light itself had been absorbed, leaving an ominous void in its place. I rewound that part of the tape several times, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Was it a trick of the lighting? A special effect? The more I watched, the more I convinced myself it wasn't an illusion. Something, or someone, had been in that house with them. Determined to uncover the truth, I reached out to one of my neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Wilkes who had lived on the street for over 40 years. When I asked if she remembered the family who lived in my house before the couple who sold it to me, her expression darkened. "I don't like talking about them," she said, her voice low. "They left in a hurry. Packed up one night and never came back. Do you know why?" I pressed gently. Mrs. Wilkes hesitated, her eyes darting to the window as if checking for something. "All I know is they abandoned most of their things. Word was something about that house didn't sit right with them." Her vague answer left me with more questions than before. What could have driven a family to abandon their home so suddenly? And what connection did it have to the tape? I decided to stop digging. Some mysteries, I reasoned, were better left unsolved. I placed the tape in a box, sealed it, and shoved it into the attic. For weeks, I avoided thinking about it. But every so often, as I lay in bed, I'd hear faint whispers in the silence of my house, just like on the tape. Months later, I attended another yard sale in the neighborhood. Browsing through the tables, I came across a tall, ornate mirror with a gilded gold frame. Its surface was warped with age, but it exuded a vintage charm that instantly drew me in. I imagined it hanging in my living room, a perfect complement to the antique-style furniture I'd recently purchased. The vendor, a wiry man with piercing blue eyes, approached as I admired the mirror. "It's special," he said, his voice calm but carrying an unsettling undertone. "Been in my family for generations. Are you sure it's what you're looking for?" His reluctance to sell the mirror struck me as odd. Most yard sale vendors were eager to offload their items, but he seemed almost protective. "I'm sure," I replied, offering a smile. "It's beautiful." He sighed, placing a hand on the mirror's edge. "All right," he said, "but it's heavy. Let me deliver it to your house." "No trouble at all." Something about his insistence unsettled me, but I agreed, giving him my address. A couple of hours later, his old pickup truck rumbled into my driveway. As he and I unloaded the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. The mirror now hangs in my living room, catching the light in the way I'd imagined. But sometimes, when I pass by, I see movement in its reflection that doesn't match the room. Just fleeting shadows, I tell myself. Nothing to worry about. Still, I can't ignore the whispers I hear at night or the uneasy feeling that my house is holding secrets far darker than I ever imagined. Whatever truths lie hidden in its history, I can only hope they stay buried. Off about it. The chair creaked as expected, its old wood responding to my movements, but nothing unusual happened. I rocked back and forth, my mind searching for rational explanations for the eerie sounds and movement. Maybe the house had shifted, or maybe it was a draft causing the chair to move. I was determined to prove to myself that it was nothing more than my imagination. Satisfied with my experiment, I left the chair and headed to bed. That night, however, the creaking sound returned, louder than ever. It no longer sounded like the gentle rocking from before, it was deliberate and steady, like someone was using the chair with purpose. My chest tightened as I listened from my bedroom, my heart pounding against my ribs. This time, I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing my phone and a flashlight, I crept out of bed and made my way toward the living room. The house was silent except for the rhythmic creak, creak, creak of the rocking chair. When I reached the doorway, I froze. The chair was moving, rocking back and forth, but no one was sitting in it. I shone the flashlight on it, half expecting to see something, or someone, there, but the chair sat empty, rocking as if an unseen force was keeping it in motion. My breath caught, and I whispered, "Who's there?" The room remained silent, the creaking the only response. Gathering my courage, I stepped closer, reaching out to stop the chair. The moment my hand touched the armrest, the rocking stopped. For a moment, I stood there in the dim light, my hand resting on the chair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then, I felt it, a sudden, ice-cold chill that seemed to emanate from the chair itself. I jerked my hand away and stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. Without thinking, I grabbed the throw blanket from the chair, flung it over the back, and bolted to my room, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I resolved to get rid of the chair. I couldn't deal with the nightly creaking, the inexplicable movements, or the oppressive feeling that now filled my living room. As much as I loved vintage furniture, this chair was more than I had bargained for. When I went to move it, I noticed something I hadn't before: faint carvings on the underside of the seat. They were intricate and unusual, almost like symbols or runes. My stomach churned as I traced the lines with my fingers, a deep unease settling over me. Who had owned this chair before? And why had the woman at the yard sale been so eager to part with it? I didn't wait to find out. I loaded the chair into my car and drove to a donation center on the edge of town. As I unloaded it, I felt a strange sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted. I left without looking back, hoping that whatever haunted that chair would stay behind. For the next few nights, the house was blissfully quiet. The creaking was gone, and I started to feel like myself again. But then, on the third night, as I lay in bed, I heard it, faint but unmistakable. The sound of creaking wood. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't coming from the living room this time. It was coming from the hallway, right outside my bedroom door. Panic set in as I stared at the door, unsure of what to do. The creaking grew louder, accompanied by the faintest sound of footsteps on the wooden floor. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it the chair, somehow returned? Or was it something worse, something that had attached itself to me? I grabbed my phone and called a friend, whispering my situation in a panic. Within 20 minutes, they arrived, banging on my front door. The noise in the hallway stopped instantly, as if whatever was there had vanished. I let my friend in, barely able to explain what had happened. Together, we searched the house from top to bottom, but everything seemed normal. The chair, thankfully, was gone. Even now, weeks later, I still hear faint creaks at night. They come and go, never loud enough to be certain, but always enough to keep me on edge. I've stopped bringing secondhand furniture into my home. In fact, I've stopped going to yard sales altogether. Some things, I've learned, are better left untouched. And as for the chair? I don't know where it ended up, but I can only hope it didn't bring its secrets, and whatever haunted it, to someone else. Sometimes, it's better not to know. The morning after dragging the chair to the curb, I woke to a strange unease. The living room, once my favorite place in the house, now felt lifeless, like the chair had taken something intangible with it. Though the chair was gone, the memories of its unnatural movements, the whispers, and the violent creaking lingered. I convinced myself it was over, but deep down, I wasn't entirely sure. Later that day, I found myself researching online, typing keywords like haunted furniture and paranormal objects. To my surprise, I stumbled upon countless forums and stories from people who had experienced similar phenomena. Items with strange histories seemed to hold onto energies, some benign, others far darker. Many claimed that these objects often carried the lingering emotions or spirits of their previous owners. While skeptics argued it was all psychological, I couldn't dismiss what I had experienced. The movement, the whispers, those weren't figments of my imagination. One forum in particular caught my attention. It was filled with advice from those who had dealt with supposedly haunted items. The consensus was clear: never bring anything secondhand into your home without cleansing it first. Methods ranged from smudging with sage to sprinkling salt around the item. Some even recommended consulting professionals to ensure the object was safe. Reading these posts gave me some comfort, but it also deepened my regret. I hadn't considered the history of the chair or the energy it might bring into my home. I'd been drawn in by its beauty without questioning what might come with it. Over the next few weeks, I worked to reclaim my space. I bought sage from a local metaphysical shop and performed a cleansing ritual, walking through every room and focusing on the living room where the chair had once sat. As the sage burned, its earthy scent filled the air, and I whispered a quiet prayer for peace and protection. I didn't know if it would work, but it made me feel proactive, like I was taking back control. To my relief, the strange occurrences stopped. No more creaking in the night, no more whispers, and no more uneasy energy lingering in the corners of the house. Life began to feel normal again, though I couldn't help but wonder where the chair had ended up and whether someone else might be experiencing what I had. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how easy it is to overlook the stories behind the objects we bring into our lives. That rocking chair had a history, one I would never fully understand, and it served as a stark reminder that not every treasure is worth the trouble. I shared my story with friends and even posted it on one of the forums I had found during my research. The responses were mixed. Some offered sympathy, others shared similar stories, and a few dismissed it all as a wild imagination. But the most valuable feedback was from those who emphasized caution. For anyone who loves vintage shopping, I offer this advice: always be mindful of the energy you invite into your home. If you're drawn to something secondhand, take a moment to consider its past. Ask yourself where it came from, who might have owned it, and why it was being sold. Even if you don't believe in the paranormal, there's no harm in being cautious. Cleansing an item before bringing it into your home can be as simple as wiping it down with intention or using sage or incense. The goal isn't just to remove physical dust, but also any lingering emotional or spiritual energy. Looking back, I'm grateful the experience wasn't worse. The rocking chair taught me an important lesson, one I won't soon forget. And while I've become more cautious about what I bring into my space, I haven't completely sworn off yard sales. After all, there's still a thrill in discovering hidden gems, so long as they don't bring hidden horrors. As I share this story, I encourage you to think about your own home and the objects within it. Have you ever felt an unexplained unease around a particular item? Have you ever wondered about its history or the lives it's touched before yours? Whether you believe in spirits, energies, or simply the power of suggestion, these questions are worth asking. Sometimes, the answers can surprise you. For now, my house is peaceful again, and I've regained my sense of safety. But every so often, late at night, I still catch myself listening for creaks or whispers, half expecting the chair to find its way back to me. And when I do, I remind myself of the importance of trust, both in my instincts and in the energy of the spaces we call home. If you're ever in a similar situation, my advice is simple: trust your gut. If something doesn't feel right, don't ignore it. Whether it's a rocking chair, an antique mirror, or even a piece of jewelry, remember that every object carries a story. And sometimes, those stories are better left untold.